Speaker.
Kevin Haig.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I want to pick up on one of the points made by David Clark in his recent contribution. It certainly is a pleasure to see Chris Bishop and Todd Barclay voting for this bill. So, Mr Speaker, I wanted to recall budgets of years gone by. I remember sitting next to the radio listening to finance ministers from the past reading out the budget, and very often there was a measure to implement or increase an excise tax on tobacco or alcohol, which would typically take effect pretty much immediately. The House would move immediately to debate a bill that would take immediate effect. And Mr Speaker, for bills of that nature, of course, there was a reason for urgency. Mr Speaker, I'm wondering actually what the reason is for urgency for this bill that actually doesn't take effect until the beginning of next year. It seems to me, Mr Speaker, that there would have been an opportunity to hear submissions from the public, submissions from the experts who could tell us whether or not this was an adequate measure. Perhaps assess this measure against the progress that New Zealand is making towards that smoke-free Aotearoa by 2025 goal that the government says that it has. And I was reminded, this is a second reading, Mr Speaker, I was reminded that in 2012, when the government introduced its last round of excise tax increases on tobacco products, in fact, we did have a select committee process. The Customs and Excise Tobacco Products Budget Measures Amendment Bill, did go to a select committee, and we heard some fascinating submissions, Mr Speaker. So I want to actually refer to some of those submissions because they relate directly to the issues that are the topic of this bill also. So in the debate so far that we've had today, we have heard one or two speakers, in particular David Seymour from the ACT Party in his extraordinary contribution, suggest that there was not evidence of effectiveness. Well, Mr Speaker, experts at that select committee brought forward incontrovertible evidence of the effectiveness of these kinds of measures. Just as one example, Mr Speaker, there was the evidence about increased calls to quit line that were associated with successive excise tax increases on tobacco. And we know, Mr Speaker, that calls to quit line are associated with quit attempts, and the more quit attempts people make, the more likely it is that they will stop smoking. So, Mr Speaker, it's very clear indeed that these excise tax increases will increase quit attempts, and those will result in more people stopping smoking. And additionally, we know that excise tax increases that put up the price are a very effective way of stopping people starting. So younger people will tend not to become smokers because of the higher price. One of the other measures, one of the other matters that submitters to that select committee brought up in relation to that bill, which, as this one does, propose successive 10% increases. One of the other pieces of evidence that submitters raised was that a jolt in the first year actually would produce a much more effective bill. And, Mr Speaker, I have no doubt that that would be the case in this case also. So if one takes, for example, that effect of discouraging from younger people from starting smoking, actually a 40% increase in the excise tax, which is what the public health community and the research experts were telling the select committee we ought to do, that would have a disproportionately beneficial effect. So, Mr. Speaker, that evidence seems to me to be also appropriate to this bill. And the government has not explained, none of the government speakers has commented on why it's not choosing to introduce a jolt, a much bigger disproportionate increase in year one, for example. The other evidence that we heard in that select committee was from very many Māori and Pacifica organisations. And they came to the select committee specifically because some people had been saying, look, this bill is going to have a detrimental effect on the poorest New Zealanders, on Māori, on Pacifica, on low socioeconomic status Pākehā, and therefore we shouldn't do it. Louisa Wall, earlier in this debate, has actually detailed some of the research that makes the very clear point that the disproportionate gains to those very New Zealanders outweigh the disproportionate cost. And that is what those groups were saying to the Select Committee. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to go on to comment on the other thing that those groups said as a bit of a qualifier to their support for the bill. They said, yes, the disproportionate gains outweigh the disproportionate costs, and so we definitely support it, but, Mr. Speaker, we want to ensure that the revenue that the government takes in from this increase in excise tax is then channelled towards ameliorating the negative effects on our community. Ameliorating the cost, the increased cost, supporting increased quitting services, supporting health promotion services around tobacco for our communities. And unfortunately, that's not what Minister Lotu Ienga has actually said the revenue is going to be used for. He's talked about the bowel screening program, he's talked about increased elective surgery. Well, actually, Mr. Speaker, what that really means is that the revenue from this excise tax is going to be channelled into the consolidated fund and substitute for revenue from that fund that would otherwise be used for actually ordinary health services. Now that is not what submitters supported in relation to the 2012 Act. It's not what we support. We believe that this bill should be used entirely for the purpose of getting us towards that smoke-free Aotearoa by 2025 goal and achieving that goal for all groups, not only middle-class Pākehā who are already on track for that, but also for Māori, for Pacifica, for low socioeconomic status Pākehā. So the Green Party continues to support the bill, but encourages the government to actually do the responsible thing, which is to use the revenue not for the consolidated fund, but for enhancing the smoke-free programs. Thank you, sir.